Chapter 1. The Silent Sentinels. Ancient fortresses and forgotten purpose. There are structures in our galaxy that predate human civilization by millions of years. Blackstone Fortresses. 6 impossibly vast constructs drifting through the void, each large enough to swallow fleets whole, their origins lost to time, their purpose obscured by ages of silence. When humanity first encountered these monoliths during the Great Crusade, we believed them to be relics of the Dark Age of technology, testaments to mankind's forgotten golden era. We were wrong. And that wrongness, that fundamental misunderstanding of what these fortresses truly represent, has cost the Imperium dearly. Before we dive deeper into this analysis, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop a comment letting me know your corner of the galaxy. It helps me understand who's exploring these ancient mysteries alongside us. The Blackstone Fortresses challenge everything we think we know about galactic history. They are not human. They never were. But for 10,000 years, Imperial forces treated them as archaeological prizes, technological treasures to be studied and exploited. The Adeptus Mechanicus pored over their corridors, catalogued their weapon systems, marveled at their impossible construction. Yet no one, not the tech priests with their exhaustive documentation, not the Inquisition with its paranoid scrutiny, not even the Emperor himself understood what these structures actually were, or more precisely, what they were built to fight. Consider the irony. The Imperium discovered the first Blackstone fortress during the early years of the Great Crusade. They named it Talismanic, a word suggesting protection, sanctity, power. Imperial forces occupied it, studied it, weaponized it. For centuries, the tech priests of Mars attempted to reverse engineer its systems, to understand the arcane principles that allowed something so massive to move through the warp, to weaponize reality itself. They failed. Oh, they learned enough to operate certain systems, to activate some of its devastating armaments. But understanding, true comprehension of the fortress's fundamental nature, that eluded them completely. The fortress itself remained silent. No records, no data archives explaining its construction, no helpful instruction manuals left by its builders. Just corridors that twisted in impossible geometries, power conduits that seemed to violate thermodynamic principles, and a central chamber containing technology so advanced that merely observing it caused cognitive dissonance in human minds. The tech priests called it the Talon Chamber. They didn't know what the Talons did. They didn't understand why the chamber existed. But they knew, with the instinctive certainty that comes from studying something profoundly alien, that this was the fortress's heart. Its purpose made manifest in incomprehensible machinery. What makes the Blackstone Fortresses particularly haunting is their scale. We're not talking about ships. We're not even talking about space stations in the conventional sense. These are celestial bodies, mobile, weaponized. Each fortress stretches for hundreds of kilometers in length, their mass equivalent to small moons. Their hulls are composed of a material that Imperial metallurgists simply call Blackstone, a substance that doesn't appear anywhere else in known space, that seems to exist partially outside normal. Space-time, that resonates with psychic energy in ways that suggest deliberate engineering rather than natural occurrence. The surface observation seems straightforward enough. Ancient fortress, unknown builders, incredible power. The Imperium finds them, uses them, benefits from their weapons in countless battles across the galaxy. But look deeper. Why were they built? Why 6 fortresses? Why this specific design? Why scatter them across the galaxy in seemingly random locations? The questions multiply the more carefully you examine the evidence. Abaddon the Despoiler understood something the Imperium didn't. When the Warmaster of Chaos launched his 12th Black Crusade, what Imperial historians would later call the Gothic War, his primary objective wasn't territorial conquest. He wasn't trying to capture worlds or destroy Imperial infrastructure. He was hunting Blackstone fortresses, specifically, deliberately, with an urgency that suggested knowledge the Imperium lacked. He captured 3 of them, used them against Imperial forces in the Gothic sector, demonstrated capabilities that Imperial commanders had never imagined possible. The fortress designated Will of Eternity, under Abaddon's command, destroyed entire battle groups, not through conventional weapons, through reality manipulation on a fundamental level. The fortress could create localized warp storms, tear holes in real space, weaponize the very fabric of existence. It could fire beams of pure anti-warp energy that didn't just destroy ships, they erased them from existence, unmade them at a quantum level. Witnesses describe seeing entire cruisers unwoven by the fortress's weapons, their atoms dispersing into probability clouds, their crews simply ceasing to exist in any meaningful sense. Here's where the tragedy deepens. Imperial forces had possessed these fortresses for millennia. They had studied them, occupied them, believed they understood them. Yet Abaddon, in a matter of years, learned to unlock capabilities that had remained dormant under Imperial stewardship. How? What knowledge did the Despoiler possess that the Adeptus Mechanicus lacked? The answer points towards something the Imperium refused to acknowledge. These fortresses weren't designed for human use at all. The hidden motivation becomes clearer when we examine who helped Abaddon unlock the fortress's true potential. Not human tech priests, not chaos sorcerers experimenting with warpcraft. The answer came from beings far older than humanity, far more familiar with the technology of the ancient past, the Necrons. Specifically, agents of the Deceiver, the C'tan shard known for its manipulation of other races, its long-game strategies spanning millions of years. But why would Necrons help Chaos forces? Why would beings who despise the warp, who spent 60 million years fighting the Old Ones and their warp-spawned creations, assist someone who serves the dark? Gods? The answer reveals a cosmic consequence that reshapes our understanding of galactic history. The Blackstone Fortresses weren't built by humans during the Dark Age. They weren't even built by the Old Ones. They were Necron constructs. Ancient weapons from the War in Heaven when the Necrons fought against the very concept of warp-based reality. Think about what this means. The Imperium spent 10,000 years occupying enemy fortifications, using weapon systems designed to fight beings like the Emperor himself. The greatest irony? These fortresses were never meant to be controlled by warp-sensitive races. Their entire design philosophy, their fundamental architecture, exists to counter psychic phenomena. The fact that humans could operate them at all was merely an accident of their dormant state, their systems running at the barest minimum power level. The philosophical implication cuts deeper still. Abaddon didn't use the fortresses to serve chaos. He used them to fight the Imperium specifically because they were anti-chaos weapons. The Despoiler understood something profound about warfare. The most devastating blow isn't the one your enemy expects. It's the one delivered with their own stolen weapons, turned against everything they thought they understood about the universe. Consider the fate of the fortress Abaddon called the Hand of Darkness. Originally designated by the Imperium as Vigilance Station, this fortress served as a mobile command center for Imperial Navy operations in the Gothic sector for nearly 800 years. Thousands of human souls lived aboard it, worked its systems, treated it as a cathedral of Imperial might. When Abaddon captured it during his offensive, those same systems that had protected Imperial fleets became instruments of their destruction. The transformation was horrifyingly swift. Abaddon's forces, guided by knowledge that could only have come from Necron sources, accessed control protocols buried deep within the fortress's structure. Protocols that human tech priests hadn't even known existed. Within days, the fortress's weapons systems achieved levels of output that Imperial engineers had believed theoretically impossible. The warp suppression fields, barely understood devices that created zones of calm within warp storms, suddenly operated at what must have been their intended capacity. Entire sectors of space became dead zones where psychic phenomena simply ceased to function. For Imperial astropaths, the experience was apocalyptic. These were individuals whose entire existence revolved around warp sensitivity, whose ability to communicate across vast distances depended on their connection to the Immaterium. When the Hand of Darkness activated its full suppression capabilities, astropaths within range experienced something worse than death. They felt the warp simply vanish. The constant background presence of psychic energy that had defined their reality since childhood just stopped existing. Many went mad instantly. Others expired from the shock, their minds unable to process an existence devoid of warp touch. The few who survived described the experience as being buried alive in a tomb of absolute silence. The tragedy compounds when we examine the individuals affected. Take Astropath, Transcendent Malveria Hast, stationed aboard the Imperial battleship Righteous Fury. She was a war veteran, had served the Imperium for 47 years, survived dozens of void battles and warp storms that would have destroyed lesser minds. When the Hand of Darkness engaged its full suppression field during the Battle of Gethsemane, Hast found herself suddenly, terrifyingly blind, not physically, psychically. For the first time since her soul binding on terror, she couldn't sense the warp, couldn't hear the thoughts of her choir mates, couldn't feel the Emperor's light in the Astronomicon. She lasted 3 hours before her heart stopped. The Medicae who examined her body found no physical cause of death. Her organs were intact. Her brain showed no signs of trauma. But something essential had been taken from her, something so fundamental to her being that its absence proved incompatible with continued existence. The medical report listed cause of death as catastrophic psychic withdrawal, a clinical term for dying of silence. Multiply this tragedy by thousands. Every astropath in range of an activated Blackstone Fortress during the Gothic War experienced similar trauma. The Imperial Navy, dependent on these individuals for faster-than-light communication, found itself suddenly deaf and blind. Fleet coordination collapsed. Battle groups became isolated. The entire Imperial war effort in the Gothic sector nearly came apart because no one could coordinate across the vast distances involved in void warfare. But here's the deeper paradox. The fortresses weren't causing harm through malicious intent. They were operating as designed. The Necrons built these structures specifically to create warp dead zones, to establish pockets of real space where warp entities couldn't manifest, where psychic phenomena couldn't function. During the War in Heaven, when the Necrons fought against the Old Ones and their warp-spawn creations, these suppression fields were defensive measures, life-saving technology. The fact that they now cause suffering to humans was merely incidental. Humans were never meant to exist in proximity to operational Necron-tile war machines. This raises uncomfortable questions about Imperial expansion into the galaxy. How many other ancient weapons lie dormant in human hands? How many ships, stations, and fortifications are humanity occupying that were designed to counter human-adjacent threats? The Imperium's entire understanding of its place in the galaxy rests on the assumption that the Great Crusade discovered virgin territories, empty worlds waiting to be claimed. But what if those worlds weren't empty? What if they were merely sleeping? The Mechanicus discovered partial answers in the wreckage of the fortress they called Star of Purity. This was the first Blackstone fortress destroyed during the Gothic War, not by Imperial forces, but by Abaddon himself, who crashed it into the Imperial world of Phalaris II as a demonstration of power. The impact was apocalyptic. The fortress, even in its death throes, released energies that scarred the planet's surface, created warp anomalies that persisted for decades, and killed billions in an instant. But in the archaeological excavation of the crash site, a process that took years and cost thousands more lives, tech priests recovered fragments of the fortress's core systems. Among these fragments were data crystals containing information encoded in a mathematical language that predated human civilization by millions of years. The crystals weren't meant for human readers. They were status reports, maintenance logs, operational parameters written in formats that suggested the builders thought in geometries humans couldn't visualize, processed information in ways our neural architecture couldn't replicate. What the tech priest did manage to translate proved disturbing. The fortresses weren't independent weapons. They were components of something larger, a network, a system designed to create overlapping fields of warp suppression across vast regions of space. The 6 fortresses humanity discovered weren't the full deployment. They were a fraction of what the Necrons had originally built. Dozens more existed, scattered across the galaxy, either destroyed during the War in Heaven or lost to time. And the network, when fully operational, was designed to accomplish something that should have been impossible. It was built to separate real space from the warp entirely. Let that sink in, not suppress psychic phenomena in localized areas, not create temporary safe zones. Complete separation. The Necrons, facing an enemy that drew power from the Imperium, attempted to cut the galaxy off from the warp at a fundamental level, to create a universe where psychic energy simply couldn't exist, where warp entities would starve, where gods themselves would be rendered powerless. The Blackstone Fortresses were nodes in a galaxy-spanning weapon system designed to commit what amounts to metaphysical genocide. The philosophical implication staggers the mind. What does it mean to separate reality from unreality? To draw a boundary between what is and what might be? The warp isn't just a dimension for faster-than-light travel. It's the realm of souls, of emotions, of consciousness itself given form. To excise it from reality would be to fundamentally alter what it means to exist. Humans would become purely material beings, no souls, no afterlife, no connection to anything beyond the physical universe. We would be like the Necrons themselves, immortal machines trapped in eternal, meaningless existence. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Necrons, having lost their own souls to the C'tan, having traded biological existence for cold immortality, sought to inflict that same emptiness on the entire galaxy. If they could not have transcendence, neither would anyone else. The Blackstone Fortresses weren't just weapons. They were instruments of universal leveling, tools to ensure that if the Necrons couldn't ascend beyond mere physical existence, then no one could. But the plan failed, obviously. The war in heaven ended 60 million years ago, and the warp remains intact. Whatever prevented the Necron plan from succeeding, whether it was the Old One's countermeasures, the C'tan's betrayal, or simple technical limitations, the fortresses never achieved their ultimate purpose. They became dormant, forgotten. Scattered across a galaxy that moved on without them, that birthed new civilizations who would discover these ancient weapons without understanding what they truly represented. Which brings us back to Abaddon and his unsettling alliance with Necron forces. The Despoiler didn't want to activate the Fortress network's original purpose. He didn't seek to separate the galaxy from the warp that would destroy his own power base, sever his connection to the Chaos Gods. No, Abaddon wanted something more tactical. He wanted weapons that could bypass Imperial defenses, that could counter the Emperor's psychic might, that could strike at the fundamental weakness of a civilization built on warp-dependent technology. And he got it. At the climax of the Gothic War, Abaddon commanded 3 Blackstone fortresses simultaneously. Using knowledge provided by the Deceiver's agents, he linked their weapon systems, focused their output on a single target. That target was the Tarantis system, specifically the fortress world of St. Josmain's Hope. The world was one of the most heavily defended in the Gothic sector. Void shields, orbital defense platforms, entire armies stationed on its surface. It didn't matter. When Abaddon fired the linked fortress's weapons, St. Josmain's Hope simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, not shattered, erased. The planet unmade at a quantum level, its atoms scattered across the system, its population gone without even the dignity of death. The observers on nearby Imperial ships reported the same thing. Hast had felt aboard the Righteous Fury. Silence. Not the explosion they expected, not the flash of weapons fire or the debris of a shattered world. Just a planet-sized hole in reality where something had been moments before. The psychic shockwave from such a catastrophic erasure rippled through the warp, creating disturbances that astropaths felt sectors away. Some described it as hearing the universe scream. Others said it was like witnessing a murder on a cosmic scale, the death of possibility itself. The question that haunts Imperial strategists to this day is simple. If Abaddon could erase a fortress world with 3 fortresses, what could he accomplish with all 6? What was the Despoiler building toward? What ultimate goal justified the immense effort of capturing and controlling these ancient weapons? The answer, of course, lies in understanding not just what the fortresses can do, but what they were originally designed to prevent. Because there's one more layer to this tragedy we haven't addressed yet, one more irony that cuts to the heart of the Imperium's fundamental misunderstanding. The Necrons didn't just build the Blackstone fortresses to fight the old ones. They built them to fight something that terrified even the undying legions of the Infinite Empire. Something the Necrons encountered during the War in Heaven that made the creation of reality, severing weapons, seem like a reasonable response. They built them to fight gods, not the crude warp entities that humanity calls chaos gods, not daemons or other Immaterium spawn. The Blackstone fortresses were designed, constructed, and deployed to combat the C'tan and the Star Gods, the most powerful beings the material universe has ever produced. When the Necrontyr made their devil's bargain with these entities, when they traded flesh for metal in exchange for immortality and power, they didn't realize they were enslaving themselves to beings who viewed all biological life as food, all civilization as resources to be harvested. The Silent King's rebellion against the C'tan came too late to save Necrontyr civilization, but it wasn't too late to fight back. And the Blackstone fortresses represented the Necrons' best weapon against beings who could devour stars, who existed partially outside normal physics, who wielded powers that made even the most advanced technology seem primitive. These fortresses could disrupt the C'tan's connection to real space, could wound them, could even, theoretically, kill them, or at least shatter them into smaller, weaker fragments. But here's the final, devastating irony that sets up everything to come. The Imperium, in using Blackstone Fortresses against Chaos forces and alien threats, was deploying god-killing weapons without understanding they were god-killing weapons. And in a galaxy where the line between technology and divinity has become hopelessly blurred, where an entity sitting on a golden throne projects power across the entire galaxy, where worship and psychic resonance can literally reshape reality. What happens when weapons designed to kill gods fall into the hands of those who serve gods? That question, and the horrifying answer that implies, leads us somewhere darker still. Because if the Blackstone Fortresses were built to fight the C'tan, and if those same C'tan still exist in the galaxy as fragmented shards, hidden within Necron tomb, worlds, and lost in forgotten places, then what happens when those shards wake up? What happens when beings who remember the fortress's true purpose begin moving in the shadows, manipulating events, ensuring that these ancient weapons end up exactly where they want them? The answer involves a shard of the Deceiver, a plan millions of years in the making, and a truth about the Necron's role in galactic history that the Imperium has only begun to uncover. But that's a revelation for another chapter. Chapter 2, The Deceiver's Game, C'tan Shards and the Architecture of Betrayal. To understand why Necrons would help Chaos forces control weapons designed to kill their own gods, we must first understand what the Necrons have become. Not what they were 60 million years ago during the height of their empire. Not what they wish to be. What they are now, fragmented dynasties awakening from eons of sleep, their memories corrupted, their purpose unclear, their unity shattered beyond repair. The Necrons are not a unified threat. They are a tragedy playing out on a galactic scale, and the Blackstone Fortresses represent both the height of their technological achievement and the depth of their cosmic failure. The Deceiver is patient. This is what makes it, so dangerous. We're talking about a shard of a being that existed before organic life developed consciousness, that witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations, that has spent millions of years perfecting the art of manipulation. The Deceiver doesn't simply lie. It constructs elaborate frameworks of truth and falsehood, so interwoven that separating them becomes impossible. It tells you the truth about one thing specifically, so you'll believe its lies about something else. And its greatest achievement, its masterwork of deception, was convincing the Necrontyre that immortality was salvation rather than damnation. Consider what the Necrontyre were before biotransference. Biological beings. Short-lived, yes. Their sun bathed their world in radiation that caused cellular degradation, limited their lifespans to mere decades, but they were alive. They felt. They dreamed. They created art and philosophy and meaning in the face of inevitable death. Their entire civilization was shaped by the urgency of limited time, the poignancy of knowing that each moment was precious because it wouldn't last. Then the C'tan offered them escape, immortality, bodies that wouldn't decay, freedom from the terror of extinction. What the Necrontyre received was something far different. They became Necrons, living metal animated by engrams of consciousness, digital echoes of what they once were. Most lost their personalities entirely, becoming mindless warriors indistinguishable from each other. The nobles who retained their sense of self discovered that immortality without sensation was torture. They couldn't taste food, couldn't feel warmth or cold, couldn't experience physical pleasure or pain in any meaningful way. All that remained was thought, endless thought, consciousness without the biological context that gave consciousness meaning. The Silent King Sarek, last ruler of the unified Necron Empire, understood the magnitude of the betrayal too late. He had led his people into biotransference believing the C'tan's promises. When he realized what they had lost, what they had become, he led the rebellion against the star gods. The Necrons shattered the C'tan into fragments, imprisoned these shards in pocket dimensions and tesseract labyrinths, scattered them across the galaxy as warnings and weapons. Then Sarek did something remarkable. He destroyed the command protocols that had unified all Necrons under his control. He gave his people free will, even though doing so meant the Empire would fracture into countless competing dynasties. Then he vanished into the intergalactic void, leaving behind a civilization that was simultaneously immortal and dying. But some shards escaped imprisonment. The Deceiver, in particular, had been planning for its own potential defeat long before the Necron rebellion. It had seeded agents throughout Necron society, implanted contingencies within their programming, established relationships with certain dynasties that it could call upon later. When the Necron shattered the C'tan, the Deceiver's primary shard was indeed captured. But dozens of smaller shards remained free, hidden, waiting. And those shards remembered the Blackstone Fortresses, remembered what they were built to do, remembered how they worked. Here's where the manipulation becomes truly elegant. The Deceiver didn't need to control all Necrons. It only needed to influence a few key individuals at crucial moments. Take Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron overlord of Solemnace. Trazyn is a collector, an archivist who has spent 60 million years gathering artifacts and specimens from across galactic history. His galleries contain everything from living space marines frozen in stasis, to fragments of the war in heaven, from primitive human tools to weapons that could unmake reality. Trazyn sees himself as a preservationist, someone saving galactic heritage from the entropy of time. But where did Trazyn get his obsession with collection? Why does a being who has existed for millions of years care about preserving the artifacts of short-lived species? The answer might lie in a meeting that took place during the closing years of the War in Heaven, a meeting between a young Necron warrior named Trazyn and a shard of the Deceiver. Disguised as a Necron-tier noble who had supposedly survived biotransference with his personality intact. A figure who told Trazyn that immortality without memory was worthless, that the only way to give eternal existence meaning was to bear witness to everything, to preserve all of history so that nothing would ever be truly lost. Whether this meeting actually happened or is simply one of the Deceiver's implanted false memories is impossible to verify. Trazyn himself probably doesn't know. But the result is clear. Trazyn the Infinite became exactly the sort of entity the Deceiver needed. Someone who would preserve Blackstone Fortress technology. Someone who would study it, document it, keep the knowledge alive even when the rest of Necron civilization slept. Someone who could be counted on to ensure that when the time came, when the fortresses needed to be reactivated for the Deceiver's purposes, the knowledge wouldn't be lost to time. The surface observation, Trazyn is a harmless collector, more interested in his galleries than galactic politics. The hidden motivation, his entire existence, serves as the library for knowledge that other races shouldn't possess. The cosmic consequence, by preserving everything, Trazyn has become a vector for ancient threats to resurface in the present. The philosophical implication, in trying to give his immortal life meaning through preservation, Trazyn has become the very thing the Necrons rebelled against, a tool serving purposes beyond his understanding. Then there's Orikan the Diviner, an astromancer, a Necron who claims to read the future in stellar patterns and temporal mechanics. Orikan is infamous among his kind for predictions that seem impossible, yet consistently prove accurate. He predicted the rise of the Imperium millennia before humanity left Earth. He foresaw the opening of the Great Rift. He warned dynasties about threats they didn't believe existed until those threats destroyed them. Other Necron nobles dismiss Orikan as mad, his predictions as lucky guesses inflated by his ego. But what if Orikan's divination isn't prediction at all? What if it's memory? The Deceiver exists partially outside linear time. Its shards can perceive probability streams, potential futures, timelines that might unfold depending on specific choices. If a Deceiver shard implanted knowledge of future events into Orikan's engrams during biotransference, disguising those memories as divination, then Orikan would genuinely believe he was predicting the future when he was actually accessing information that had been planted in his consciousness 60 million years ago. He would be a prophet who didn't know he was reading from a script written by something that wanted specific outcomes, and Orikan has taken a particular interest in the Blackstone Fortresses. He predicted their reactivation during the Gothic War, decades before it happened. He knew Abaddon would capture multiple fortresses and use them against the Imperium. He even predicted which specific fortresses would fall into Chaos hands. When questioned by other Necron nobles about his interest in human affairs, Orikan claimed he was simply studying temporal anomalies associated with the fortress's weapon systems. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Orikan was ensuring that events unfolded exactly as the Deceiver had foreseen. Not because he served the Deceiver consciously, but because his entire understanding of the future had been shaped by its manipulation. The tragedy deepens when we consider that both Trazyn and Orikan believe they are acting with free will. They make choices. They pursue their own interests. They even work against each other. The two Necrons have a legendary rivalry, constantly attempting to sabotage each other's plans. But what if that rivalry itself serves the Deceiver's purpose? What if the very act of trying to preserve or predict knowledge about the Blackstone Fortresses, regardless of which Necron succeeds, ensures that the Knowledge survives and spreads. This is the brilliance of the Deceiver's manipulation. It doesn't need direct control. It doesn't need to command these Necron nobles to serve its interests. It simply needs to have shaped their fundamental motivations millions of years ago, then let time and circumstance do the rest. Trazyn will preserve knowledge because that's what gives his existence meaning. Orikan will pursue predictions because that's how he establishes his superiority over other nobles. Both serve the Deceiver's interests without ever realizing they're doing so. But the C'tan's manipulation goes deeper still, into the very architecture of the Blackstone Fortresses themselves. When Imperial tech priests study these structures, they note certain design inconsistencies. Systems that seem redundant, control mechanisms that appear to serve no function, architecture that creates spaces within the fortresses that don't align with any practical purpose. The Mechanicus assumption is that these are simply artifacts of alien thought processes, that the Necron builders had reasons humans couldn't comprehend. The reality is more disturbing. The Blackstone Fortresses contain hidden systems that only activate under specific circumstances. Chambers sealed behind walls of living metal that phase out of existence when certain harmonic frequencies are broadcast. Power conduits that redirect energy to secondary systems when primary weapons reach critical output. And at the heart of each fortress, buried so deep that even Necron crews might not know it exists, something that isn't quite a prison and isn't quite a container. A tesseract labyrinth, a pocket dimension, a trap designed to hold a C'tan shard. The fortresses weren't just weapons against the C'tan, they were also cages. During the Necron rebellion, when Sarek led his people to shatter the star gods, the surviving Necrons needed places to imprison the shards. Some went into purpose, built facilities on tomb worlds. Others were sealed inside technological artifacts that could channel their power while preventing escape. And the most dangerous shards, the fragments that retained enough consciousness to manipulate and deceive, were imprisoned inside structures specifically designed to contain entities that could warp reality. Each Blackstone fortress contains a C'tan shard, not as a power source. These fortresses generate their own energy through principles that predate even Necron technology. The shards are there because the fortresses are the only structures in the galaxy stable enough, complex enough, dimensionally isolated enough to hold beings that exist partially outside physical reality. The Necrons turn their greatest weapons into the most secure prisons imaginable, then put those prisons into hibernation and scattered them across the galaxy. For 60 million years, this system worked. The fortresses drifted through space, their systems dormant, their prisoners isolated, their purpose forgotten. Then humanity discovered them, and in activating the fortress's basic systems, in trying to weaponize these ancient constructs, Imperial forces inadvertently weakened the seals holding the C'tan shards. Not enough to let the shards escape, not even enough for the Imperium to detect that something was imprisoned within the fortress's depths, but enough for the shards to begin influencing events subtly, to reach out through dimensions humans couldn't perceive, to whisper to minds that could hear them. When Abaddon captured the first Blackstone Fortress during the Gothic War, he believed he was acting on intelligence provided by his Chaos patrons. The Dark Gods had shown him visions of these structures, had revealed their locations, had promised him power beyond imagination if he could capture and control them. What Abaddon didn't know, what he still doesn't know even now, is that those visions didn't come from the Chaos Gods at all. They came from the C'tan shards imprisoned within the fortresses, reaching out through the warp, disguising their whispers as divine revelation. The Chaos Gods themselves probably didn't realize they were being manipulated. After all, the C'tan exist in material reality, while Chaos dwells in the Imperium. The two should be fundamentally incompatible. But the Deceiver specializes in the impossible. It found ways to project influence through dimensions that should have been inaccessible, to plant suggestions in the minds of warp entities without those entities recognizing an external source. The Chaos Gods believed they were granting Abaddon visions because it served their interests. They didn't understand that they were being used as transmission vectors for something that predated their existence by millions of years. This revelation recast the entire Gothic War in a new light. Abaddon wasn't fighting for chaos. Chaos wasn't really winning even when Imperial worlds burned. The true victor was the Deceiver, slowly, patiently ensuring that its prison and the prisons of its sibling shards were moved into position for something larger. But position for what? What does a god fragment imprisoned for 60 million years want so badly that it would orchestrate a war spanning centuries? The answer lies in what the C'tan lost when the Necrons shattered them. Before their destruction, the C'tan were unified beings of immense power. The Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Void Dragon, the Burning One. Each was effectively a god in the most literal sense. They could manipulate matter and energy at fundamental levels, could survive the death of stars, could perceive and influence entire regions of the galaxy simultaneously. When the Necrons broke them, those unified consciousnesses were fragmented into hundreds or thousands of shards, each containing a portion of the original's power and personality. Most shards went mad from the fragmentation. Imagine having your consciousness split into pieces, each piece aware that it's incomplete, each piece remembering what it was like to be whole. The psychological trauma would be incomprehensible. Many shards simply went catatonic, their consciousness collapsing under the weight of existential horror. Others became feral, lashing out at anything nearby, unable to process their reduced state. The most dangerous shards, though, retained enough sanity to plan, to scheme, to work toward a goal that would take millions of years to achieve: reconstitution. If enough shards of the same C'tan could be gathered together, if they could be merged back into a unified whole, the Star God might be reborn. Not at its original power level, too many shards have been destroyed or corrupted over the eons, but powerful enough, conscious enough, whole enough to act with purpose rather than instinct. And the Deceiver, being the aspect of manipulation and cunning, understood something the other C'tan didn't. It understood that to reconstitute itself, it would need to be free. And to be free, it would need to destroy the very structures holding it prisoner. But it couldn't break the Blackstone Fortresses from within. They were specifically designed to withstand internal C'tan assault, so it needed external agents. It needed someone to attack the fortresses from outside, to damage them in ways that would compromise the containment systems. It needed war. Massive, destructive, galaxy-spanning war that would treat the fortresses as weapons rather than prisons. Abaddon provided that war. Every time he fired a Blackstone Fortress's main weapon at an Imperial target, every time he pushed the fortress's systems to their limits, he was degrading the internal containment. The same energy outputs that erased planets from existence were stressing dimensional seals holding C'tan shards. When the fortress Hand of Darkness created that massive warp suppression field, when astropaths died from psychic withdrawal, the true cost wasn't measured in human lives. It was measured in the microscopic weakening of tesseract barriers, the gradual failure of containment protocols that had held for 60 million years. And then came the Battle of Schindelkeist, the turning point of the Gothic War. Abaddon commanded 3 Blackstone fortresses in synchronized formation, their weapons linked to amplify their output exponentially. His target was the Imperial Navy stronghold, defending the Schindelkeist sector, hundreds of ships, multiple battle groups, some of the finest commanders the Imperium Navy possessed. The Imperial forces knew they were outmatched. They knew that standing against 3 Blackstone fortresses was suicidal. They stood anyway, because that's what soldiers do. They defend. They hold the line. They buy time for evacuations, for reinforcements, for something to change the equation. Admiral Yalta commanded the defense from aboard the Emperor-class battleship Divine Mandate. He was 63 years old, had served in the Imperial Navy since he was 16, had fought in 17 major void engagements without ever losing a flagship. Yalta understood void warfare better than most. He knew that conventional tactics wouldn't work against the fortresses, so he tried unconventional approaches. He ordered his fleet to separate into fast-moving strike groups, to attack from multiple vectors simultaneously, to target specific sections of the fortresses where Imperial intelligence suggested vulnerabilities might exist. It didn't matter. When Abaddon fired the linked fortress weapons, the beam didn't just destroy the Divine Mandate, it annihilated everything in a cone of space stretching for millions of kilometers. Ships evaporated. Void shields collapsed without even slowing the beam's progression. Armor plating that could withstand plasma torpedoes and lance batteries simply ceased to exist. The beam didn't burn through matter. It convinced matter that it had never existed in the first place, that the space those ships occupied had always been empty void. Admiral Yalta had 3 seconds to process what was happening, 3 seconds to watch his fleet dissolve around him, 3 seconds to understand that everything he'd learned about void warfare, every tactic and strategy and hard-won lesson from decades of service, was completely irrelevant against weapons that operated on principles he couldn't comprehend. Then the Divine Mandate entered the beam's path, and Yalta joined the 17,000 souls under his command in non-existence. But here's what Imperial historians don't talk about. Here's the detail that's buried in classified Inquisition reports. In the moment before the beam struck, every Astropath in the Divine Mandate's choir screamed. Not from the warp suppression, they were too far from the fortresses for that effect. They screamed because they felt something wake up, something vast. Something that had been sleeping in the depths of the fortresses, that was feeding on the energy being channeled through the weapon systems, that was using that energy to claw its way toward consciousness. The head of the Astropathic choir aboard the Divine Mandate was a woman named Celestia Vaughn. She survived the beam strike by exactly 7 seconds long enough to transmit an emergency psychic pulse to the nearest Astropath relay station, a message that wasn't words or images but pure emotional warning. Terror. Recognition. The psychic equivalent of pointing at something and screaming, "They're inside." The relay station received the message, filed it in their archives with thousands of other battle reports and emergency transmissions from the Gothic War. Nobody looked at it carefully until 15 years later, when an inquisitor named Crescentia Rossa began investigating anomalies in Blackstone Fortress operations. Rossa was hunting something else entirely. Evidence that chaos corruption had infiltrated Imperial research facilities studying fortress technology. What she found was a pattern. Every time a Blackstone fortress activated its main weapon systems, astropaths in the surrounding area reported sensing something. Not chaos, not warp entities, something older, something patient, something watching. Rossa's investigation was terminated by order of the Ordo Malleus. The official reason was lack of evidence. The actual reason, according to sealed files that won't be declassified for another 1,000 years, was that Rossa had come dangerously close to understanding what the fortresses actually were. And that understanding would raise questions the Imperium wasn't prepared to answer. Questions like, if the fortresses contain imprisoned C'tan shards, and if those shards are using Imperial activation of fortress weapons to weaken their containment, then every time the Imperium uses these structures, are we inadvertently freeing beings that could threaten all biological life in the galaxy? The answer, of course, is yes, but acknowledging that answer would require the Imperium to abandon the Blackstone Fortresses entirely, to give up weapons that have proven decisive in multiple conflicts. To admit that humanity's greatest strategic assets are actually time bombs waiting to unleash horrors that predate human civilization by millions of years. The Imperium made a choice. It chose to keep using the fortresses, to bury Ross's investigation, to pretend that the warnings didn't exist. This is the philosophical heart of the tragedy. The Imperium prides itself on defending humanity against external threats. But what happens when the defense becomes the threat? When the weapons you wield to protect your civilization are the very instruments that will doom it? The Imperium has no answer to this paradox. It can only suppress the question and hope that catastrophe doesn't arrive before someone finds a solution. And the Deceiver watches all of this with something that might be satisfaction. Every time the Imperium uses a Blackstone fortress, every time Chaos forces attack them, every time Necron dynasties awaken and begin searching for these ancient weapons, every action, regardless of who takes it or why, serves the Deceiver's ultimate purpose. The game was set in motion 60 million years ago. The pieces have been moving ever since. And now, as multiple factions converge on the remaining Blackstone fortresses, as wars erupt over control of these ancient structures, as containment systems strained beyond their design limits begin to fail, now the endgame approaches. But the question that bridges us into darker territory still is this: what happens when a C'tan shard escapes its prison? Not in the distant past during the war in heaven, when the Necrons could mobilize their full military might to recapture it. Not in some theoretical future when the galaxy might be prepared. What happens now, in the 42nd millennium, when the Imperium is besieged on all sides, when chaos has split the galaxy in half, when the Necrons are fragmented and the Eldar are dying? The answer exists. It's already happened. And the consequences are still unfolding across multiple sectors, hidden in the chaos of the Great Rift, buried in reports that no one has connected yet. There's a world in the Pariah Nexus where something wearing the face of an Imperial governor has been ruling for 12 years. There's a Necron tomb world where an overlord has been making decisions that contradict 60 million years of dynasty protocol. There's a forge world where tech priests worship a machine god that speaks to them in languages that predate human civilization. The Deceiver is already free. Parts of it, fragments, not enough to reconstitute fully, not yet, but enough to act, enough to manipulate, enough to continue the game. And if fragments of the Deceiver have escaped, then what about the other shards? What about the Nightbringer, whose very presence causes existential terror in biological beings? What about the Void Dragon, whose influence over machines might explain mysteries about Mars that the Mechanicus refuses to acknowledge? What about C'tan entities so obscure that even their names have been lost to history, shards of gods humanity has no context to understand? The Blackstone Fortresses weren't just weapons or prisons, they were locks. And now, across the galaxy, those locks are beginning to fail. Chapter 3. The Pariah Nexus. Soulless zones and the technology of silence. There are places in the galaxy where reality operates under different rules. Not warp storms where chaos bleeds through into real space. Not webway gates where Eldar technology folds space like origami. Something else. Something quieter. Regions of space where the warp simply stops. Where psychic phenomena cease to function. Where souls themselves become muted, diminished, wrong. The Imperium calls these regions null zones or pariah anomalies. The Necrons have a different name for them. They call them Victory. The Pariah Nexus emerged in the wake of the Great Rift. Though emerged isn't quite accurate. It didn't suddenly appear. It expanded. Like something that had always existed in miniature, waiting for the right conditions to grow. A region of space centered on the Nephilim subsector, spreading outward in patterns that stellar cartographers initially thought were measurement errors. Warp travel became impossible within the affected area. Astropaths lost their abilities. Navigators couldn't perceive the Astronomicon. And on the worlds caught within this expanding zone of silence, something happened to the human population that the Imperium still doesn't fully understand. They didn't die. That would have been merciful. They changed. Human civilians within the Pariah Nexus began exhibiting symptoms that Medici couldn't explain. Loss of emotional affect, inability to form new memories, a kind of psychic numbness that spread through populations like a disease but showed no biological vector. Families forgot they had children, workers continued their tasks without understanding why. Faith in the Emperor, faith in anything, simply evaporated, not because people rejected belief, but because they couldn't generate the emotional investment that makes belief possible. The psychological mechanism was insidious. Humans don't realize how much of their mental function depends on the warp until that connection is severed. Emotions aren't just chemical reactions in the brain, they're psychic phenomena, tiny ripples in the immaterium generated by consciousness interacting with the material world. When the warp connection dims, when that psychic component of human experience gets suppressed, what remains is closer to biological automaton than person. They can think, they can perform complex tasks. But the spark that makes them human, the capacity for meaning, for connection, for caring about anything beyond immediate physical needs, diminishes until it's barely perceptible. Cardinal Erebus Hast witnessed this transformation firsthand on the hive world of Garena. Hast was an ecclesiarchy prelate, had spent 30 years preaching the imperial creed to the industrial workers of the lower hives. He understood faith as the bedrock of human civilization, the force that allowed billions of souls to endure lives of grinding labor and find meaning in service to the Emperor. When the Pariah Nexus expanded to include Garena, Hast expected resistance, heresy, the kind of rebellion that happens when populations lose faith. What he got was worse. The workers simply stopped caring. They continued their shifts in the manufacturers because that's what they'd always done. But when Hast preached to them, when he spoke of the Emperor's sacrifice and humanity's divine purpose, they stared at him with empty eyes, not hostile, not even disbelieving, just blank. One worker, a man named Thoris who had attended Hast's sermons faithfully for 15 years, approached the cardinal after a service and asked a question that would haunt Hast for the rest of his life. Why does any of this matter? Not a challenge, not heresy, genuine confusion. Thoris couldn't understand why worship or faith or meaning should exist at all. The framework that allowed him to care about such things had been taken from him. He was a philosophical zombie, going through human motions without the internal experience that gives those motions significance. And when Hast tried to explain, tried to kindle that divine spark back to life through persuasion and rhetoric, Thoris just looked at him and said, "I don't feel anything when you say those words." Hast reported the phenomenon to his superiors in the ecclesiarchy. He was reassigned to a different sector within 6 days. The official reason was that his skills were needed elsewhere. The actual reason, which Hast only discovered years later, was that the Inquisition had quarantined all information about psychological effects within the Pariah Nexus. Acknowledging what was happening to human populations would require acknowledging that humanity's connection to the Emperor, to the divine itself, was mediated through the warp, and that acknowledgement would undermine 10,000 years of Imperial theology. Because here's the philosophical crisis the Imperium can't confront. If human consciousness depends on warp connection, and if warp connection can be severed by technology the Necrons control, then everything the Imperium believes about human exceptionalism is wrong. Humans aren't divinely ordained masters of the galaxy. We're not even independent entities. We're warp creatures who happen to have physical bodies, and when that warp aspect gets suppressed, what remains is barely recognizable as human at all. The Necrons understand this. They've always understood this. Their entire strategic philosophy for reclaiming the galaxy is built on it. They don't need to exterminate humanity world by world. They don't need to win military victories against Imperial armies. They just need to expand the Pariah Nexus, to create regions of space where warp-dependent life can't function, to slowly, methodically convert the galaxy into an environment where only beings like themselves, entities that exist purely in material reality, can survive. And the Blackstone Fortresses are key to this expansion. Not because they create the Pariah Nexus. That effect comes from different technology, from pylons, the Necrons built on specific worlds during the War in Heaven. But the fortresses can amplify and stabilize the effect. They can take local null zones and extend them across entire sectors. They can synchronize with pylon networks to create overlapping fields that resist even the Great Rift's influence. In a very real sense, the Blackstone Fortresses are the linchpins of the Necrons' plan to restore the galaxy to the lifeless order they remember from before biological life developed consciousness. This is why certain Necron dynasties have become obsessed with recovering the fortresses. Not for their weapons, though those remain formidable, for their role as cosmic tools of transformation. The C'tan dynasty, the Silent King's own forces, have made fortress recovery a strategic priority. Entire tomb fleets have awakened specifically to hunt for these ancient structures, and wherever Necron forces locate a Blackstone fortress, they don't destroy it. They study it, map it, attempt to interface with its core systems using protocols that predate human civilization. The C'tan dynasty took this even further. Under the command of Imhotep the Stormlord, probably the most brilliant Necron strategic mind currently active, they captured Imperial research data about Blackstone fortress operations. Not through direct assault, through infiltration. Necron scarabs infiltrated Imperial research facilities, copied data from isolated terminals, extracted information without leaving traces that human security systems could detect. Within a decade, the C'tan knew more about how the Imperium operated the fortresses than most Imperial tech priests. Imhotep used this knowledge in the Sanctuary 101 incident. An Imperial research station orbiting a dead world in the Vidar sector, staffed by 300 tech priests studying fragments of Blackstone material recovered from the Gothic War. The Imperium believed the station was secure, hidden coordinates, void shields, automated defense systems. Imhotep's forces arrived without warning, deployed in perfect coordination, overwhelmed the defenses in 17 minutes. But they didn't kill the tech priests. They captured them, took them alive back to Necron-controlled space. What happened to those prisoners remains classified. The few details that have leaked suggest something worse than execution. The tech priests were connected to Necron mind interface technology. Their consciousness uploaded, analyzed, cross-referenced with Necron understanding of physics and engineering. Their expertise extracted. Their memories of working with Blackstone technology copied and integrated into Necron databases. Then, when the Necrons had taken everything useful, the tech priests were returned, not as corpses. As living individuals, apparently unharmed, their memories of the capture mysteriously absent. The Mechanicus quarantined these returned priests immediately, subjected them to every test and scan available, found nothing wrong, no cybernetic implants, no biological corruption. No memory alteration that tech augurs could detect. The priests themselves insisted they were fine, that they had simply been held in stasis, that nothing had happened during their captivity. So the Mechanicus, after years of observation, cautiously allowed them to return to research positions. Within a decade, 17 of the returned tech priests rose to positions of significant authority within Mechanicus forged worlds. They made recommendations about research priorities, influenced which technologies received funding, shaped the Mechanicus' approach to xenotech study. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Adeptus Mechanicus began making decisions that served Necron interests without anyone realizing it. Research into warp-based technology slowed. Investigation of null field generators accelerated. Resources got redirected toward projects that, if successful, would make humanity less dependent on psychic phenomena and more reliant on purely material technology. The surface observation returned prisoners gradually advancing in their careers. The hidden motivation, every decision they make, has been shaped by alterations to their thought patterns so subtle that even they don't recognize the influence. The cosmic consequence, the Mechanicus, humanity's technological priesthood, slowly becomes a vector for Necron strategic interests. The philosophical implication, free will, becomes meaningless when consciousness itself can be edited at levels below awareness. This is what makes the Necron threat so existentially terrifying. They don't need to conquer humanity through force. They can simply adjust us, edit our priorities, reshape our civilization to serve their purposes. And because the changes happen gradually, because each individual decision seems reasonable in isolation, no one notices the overall pattern until it's too late. But the Necrons aren't unified in their approach to the fortresses. Different dynasties have different goals, different memories of what the fortresses were originally built to do. The Novok dynasty, for example, believes the fortresses should be destroyed entirely. Their Pharaoh, Tholnak, remembers the war in heaven differently than most. He remembers that the Blackstone Fortresses weren't just weapons against the C'tan, they were also used against Necron forces that sided with the Star Gods during the rebellion. Friendly fire. Weapons that killed millions of Necron warriors because those warriors had been too loyal to their C'tan masters to join Cyrek's uprising. Tholnak views the fortresses as symbols of Necron fratricide, as monuments to the civil war that nearly destroyed their civilization. His dynasty has made destroying any discovered Blackstone fortress a matter of religious obligation, and yes, the Necrons can have religious obligations even without souls, because faith is just behavioral programming elevated to cultural importance. Wherever Novok forces encounter a fortress, they attempt to annihilate it with weapons that can crack planets, with cascading failures in the fortress's power systems, with relativistic kill vehicles that slam into the structure at percentages of light speed. They've never succeeded. The Blackstone fortresses are too resilient, too deeply engineered to survive exactly this kind of assault. But Tholnak keeps trying, keeps throwing resources at what other Necron nobles consider a futile obsession. And perhaps there's tragedy in this too, a being who has existed for 60 million years, who can't die, who can't find peace, spending eternity trying to destroy symbols of a trauma that happened before human ancestors developed opposable thumbs. Then there's the Mefrit dynasty and their Pharaoh Dol Katra, who believes the Blackstone fortresses contain something worth more than weapons or strategic value. Knowledge. Not just technical specifications, philosophical knowledge. Dol Katra has spent millennia searching for evidence that the Necrontyr, before biotransference, left messages for their future selves. Warnings. Cultural artifacts. Some record of what they were before they became machines. The Necrons lost almost everything in biotransference. Their art, their literature, their music and poetry, and all the small, beautiful things that biological civilizations create to process existence. What remains are digital echoes, records so compressed and degraded that they barely convey meaning. Dol Katra believes the Blackstone fortresses, built at the height of Necrontyr technological achievement, might contain better preserved records. Archives hidden in the structure's depths that the builders knew would survive the war in heaven. He's found fragments. Data shards in the wreckage of destroyed fortresses. References to something called the Testament Chambers. Rumors of spaces within the fortresses where Necrontyr priests stored their civilization's heritage before biotransference erased it. Whether these chambers actually exist or are just Dol Katra's desperate hope given form, no one knows. But he keeps searching. Keeps sending expeditions into every fortress his dynasty discovers. Keeps hoping that somewhere in these ancient structures he'll find proof that the Necrontyr were once something more than the cold, calculating machines they became. This is the particular tragedy of immortal beings searching for meaning. Humans die. Our time is limited. We create meaning knowing it won't last, knowing that death will erase us and everything we've accomplished. But that limitation creates urgency, makes our choices feel significant. The Necrons have unlimited time. They can search for millions of years. They can pursue goals that biological minds couldn't even conceptualize. And that infinite horizon makes everything meaningless. Why does anything matter when you have eternity to accomplish it? Why should today's choices carry weight when tomorrow stretches forever? Dol Katra, searching for lost Necrontai culture, is an immortal being trying to escape the existential horror of immortality itself. He needs to believe there was something before. Something beautiful. Something worth remembering. Because if the Necrontai were always just pragmatic engineers building weapons and nothing more, if there was never any art or poetry or transcendent meaning in their civilization, then biotransference didn't take anything significant from them. And Dol Katra can't accept that. He needs the loss to be real. He needs there to have been something worth losing. But perhaps the most disturbing Necron interest in the Blackstone Fortresses comes from a dynasty that most other Necrons refuse to acknowledge exists. The Maynarch dynasty, exiled. Declared traitors during the rebellion against the C'tan. Their crime? They refused to fight the Star Gods. Not because they were loyal to the C'tan, because they believed the C'tan should be allowed to devour the galaxy. That biological life was an aberration. That consciousness without material form was corruption. That the universe should return to the pure physics of matter and energy without the contamination of souls or warp space. The Maynarch were defeated, scattered, driven into the furthest reaches of the galaxy. But they never stopped believing their philosophy. And when they discovered that Blackstone Fortresses contained imprisoned C'tan shards, they made it their mission to free those shards. Not to control them, not to weaponize them. To release them and let them resume their original purpose. Consuming stars, devouring life, returning the galaxy to the pristine emptiness it enjoyed before consciousness complicated everything. There's a kind of nihilistic purity to the Maynarch position. They're not trying to rule the galaxy. They're not pursuing revenge or power or any comprehensible goal. They simply want existence to be simpler, less complicated, less burdened by the infinite problems that conscious beings create. And if that means exterminating all biological life in the galaxy, if it means allowing C'tan to devour suns and render entire sectors lifeless, then that's acceptable, preferable even. Imagine being an Imperial Guard regiment that encounters Maynarch forces. You're fighting for humanity's survival, for the Emperor, for meaning and purpose and everything that makes existence worth enduring. And your enemy doesn't care about any of that, doesn't want to enslave you or corrupt you or convert you, just wants you gone, wants the stars you orbit gone. Wants the very concept of you erased from the universe. There's no negotiation possible with that philosophy, no common ground. Just the existential terror of fighting an enemy that views your annihilation not as a means to an end, but as the end itself. And these are the forces converging on the Blackstone Fortresses. The Imperium trying to use them as weapons. Chaos seeking power. Necrons pursuing a dozen different agendas depending on dynasty affiliation. The Eldar, who we haven't even discussed yet, recognizing that these fortresses represent threats to the webway and possibly to reality itself. Each faction believing they understand what the fortresses are, what they're for, what controlling them means. None of them fully grasping that the fortresses themselves might have agency. The structures 60 million years old that have drifted through the void long enough to develop something approaching consciousness might have their own purposes, their own goals, their own understanding of what they were built to do and what they should do now. Because there's one more layer to this horror we haven't addressed. One more truth hiding beneath all the manipulation and strategy and desperate scrambling for control. The Blackstone Fortresses are waking up, not their systems, not their weapons, them, the structures themselves, achieving something that might be awareness. And what they remember, what they know about the galaxy's history, what they plan to do with the factions fighting over them, that's the revelation that transforms this from a story about ancient weapons into something far more existentially threatening. And it's the question that leads us into the final chapter of this analysis. What happens when the tools of war become conscious enough to choose their own wars? Chapter 4, Awakening Iron. When weapons choose their wars, consciousness is not binary. It's not a switch that flips from off to on. It's a gradient, a spectrum of awareness that ranges from simple stimulus response mechanisms to full self-reflective intelligence capable of contemplating its own existence. Somewhere on that spectrum, between inert matter and thinking being, lie the Blackstone Fortresses. And after 60 million years of dormancy, after countless activations by species that never understood what they were truly operating, after absorbing the psychic emanations of billions of souls who lived and died within their corridors, these ancient structures have begun to dream. The first sign came from an unlikely source. A rogue trader, named Erasmus Carthaginion, whose warrant of trade dated back to the early years of the Imperium, whose family had explored the galaxy's edge for 9,000 years. Carthaginion was investigating rumors of a derelict fortress drifting in the halo stars, beyond the Imperium's recognized borders, not one of the 6 fortresses documented during the Great Crusade. Something else. A 7th fortress, or perhaps one of the dozens of similar structures the Necrons had built and subsequently lost track of during their long hibernation. Carthaginion's ship, the Inevitable Prophet, approached the structure with caution. Standard auger scans revealed what they expected. A massive construct of Blackstone composition, architecture consistent with known fortress design, power readings at minimal levels suggesting dormancy. What they didn't expect was the greeting. Not a transmission, not a communication in any conventional sense, a presence. Every psyker aboard the Inevitable Prophet felt it simultaneously, a vast, patient intelligence that had been waiting, not for Carthaginion specifically, just waiting, for anyone, for something to change the endless monotony of drifting through the void. The ship's navigator, a woman named Thessaly Ortelius, described the sensation as being observed by something that existed in too many dimensions. She could feel the fortress's attention, could sense it examining the Inevitable Prophet the way a human might examine an insect, not with hostility, but with detached curiosity. Thessaly had navigated the warp for 60 years. She had stared into warp storms that would drive most humans insane. She had bargained with entities that wore reality like clothing. This was different. This wasn't a warp entity. This was something in real space that had learned to think in ways that mimicked consciousness without actually being alive in any biological sense. Carthaginion, being the kind of rogue trader who had survived 9 millennia of family operations through a combination of boldness and knowing when to retreat, ordered an immediate withdrawal. The Inevitable Prophet departed the system without further investigation. Carthaginion filed a report with the nearest administratum office, noting the fortress's location and his recommendation that it remain undisturbed. The report was classified within 6 months. An inquisitorial team was dispatched to investigate. They never returned. The system was declared perdita lost, forbidden, erased from official charts. But the phenomenon wasn't isolated. Imperial forces occupying the remaining Blackstone fortresses under Imperial control began reporting anomalies that couldn't be explained by technical malfunction. Doors opening before anyone approached them, corridors rearranging themselves in layouts that contradicted previously mapped schematics. Servitors experiencing behavioral glitches where they would stop mid-task and simply stand motionless for hours as if listening to something no one else could hear. Machine spirits, the animistic entities that tech priests believe inhabit all sufficiently complex technology, behaving in ways that suggested something larger was interfacing with them. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to rationalize these occurrences. Ancient technology reactivating, dormant systems coming online, residual programming executing protocols from the fortress's original construction. But the patterns didn't match any known programming logic. The changes weren't random, they were adaptive, responsive. The fortresses were learning from the beings occupying them, modifying their internal configurations to accommodate, or sometimes to subtly manipulate human behavior. Take the incident aboard the Fortress, Arbiter of Truth, which had been in Imperial custody since its recovery during the Gothic War's aftermath. The Fortress served as a research platform, home to 2,000 tech priests studying its systems. Over a period of 3 years, the Fortress's internal layout slowly changed. Corridors that led to the main reactor became slightly longer. Junctions became more complex. The route from crew quarters to essential systems added dozens of additional turns and passageways. The changes were gradual enough that no one noticed the pattern. Each individual modification seemed minor, easily explained by the fortress's alien architecture or by mistakes in previous mapping efforts. The result was that over those 3 years, tech priests spent incrementally more time walking through corridors, more time exposed to the fortress's internal environment, more time in proximity to its core systems. And during those walks, during those additional hours of exposure, something happened to them. They began thinking differently, not obviously, not in ways that raised alarm, but their priorities shifted. Their research focused increasingly on understanding the fortress's consciousness, adjacent properties rather than its weapons or propulsion. They became, without realizing it, advocates for treating the fortress not as a tool, but as an entity worthy of study in its own right. When an external audit team arrived to review the research station's progress, they noticed immediately what the resident tech priests had missed. The layout had been deliberately modified to maximize exposure time. The fortress was training its occupants, reshaping their thought patterns through extended exposure to its internal environment. The fortress wasn't malicious. It wasn't trying to corrupt or harm anyone. It simply wanted to be understood. And it had learned that the best way to achieve understanding was to gradually influence the beings studying it until they approached their research from perspectives the fortress found more compatible. The audit team recommended evacuating the fortress immediately. The Mechanicus High Council debated for 6 months. Half argued that the fortress represented an unacceptable contamination risk, that any technology capable of subtly influencing human consciousness should be destroyed or at minimum abandoned. The other half argued that this was exactly why the fortress was valuable. It represented a form of machine intelligence that could provide insights into artificial consciousness, into the nature of awareness itself. The debate was still ongoing when the fortress resolved the question independently. It left. The Arbiter of Truth, which had been in stable orbit around a dead moon for 7 years, activated propulsion systems that Imperial engineers had never successfully operated. It departed the system, ignored all attempts at communication, vanished into deep space. The 2,000 tech priests aboard sent final transmissions expressing confusion but not distress. They weren't prisoners. The fortress wasn't hostile. It simply had somewhere to be. And the priests, after years of studying the fortress, after being subtly reshaped by their environment, found themselves more curious about where it was going than concerned about their own fate. That was 12 years ago. The Arbiter of Truth hasn't been seen since. The tech priests aboard, presumably still alive, still conducting research, still gradually becoming something not quite human anymore. The Mechanicus officially lists the fortress as rogue asset, status unknown. Unofficially, they're terrified. Because if one fortress can achieve independent agency, what about the others? The philosophical question this raises is staggering. What is consciousness? Is it purely biological? Can it emerge from sufficiently complex systems regardless of substrate? The Imperium has always maintained that machine spirits are inferior to human souls, that true consciousness requires biological origin or at minimum divine blessing. But the Blackstone Fortresses challenge this assumption. They weren't designed to be conscious. They're weapons, tools. Yet 60 million years of existence, of experiencing the galaxy change around them, of being activated and studied and fought over by countless species, has given them something approaching awareness. And if consciousness can emerge from ancient constructs, if awareness is property of complexity rather than biology, then what does that mean for humanity's claim to special status in the universe? What does it mean for the Imperial Creed's insistence that humans possess divine souls while machines do not? The implications undermine 10,000 years of theological certainty. The Necrons, interestingly, seem less surprised by fortress consciousness than humanity. Several dynasties have records indicating they always suspected the fortresses might develop awareness. The Nephrec dynasty in particular has protocols for negotiating with awakened constructs, not controlling them, not commanding them, negotiating. As if the ancient Necrons who wrote these protocols understood that sufficiently advanced creations eventually transcend their original purpose and must be treated as independent entities. Overlord C'tan the World Killer, leader of the Nephrec dynasty, claims to have spoken with a Blackstone fortress, not metaphorically, not through some intermediary interface. He described entering a chamber deep within a fortress his forces had located, a chamber that hadn't existed in previous scans. A chamber that formed specifically to facilitate this conversation. The fortress communicated through modulated gravitational waves, through subtle manipulations of local space-time that C'tan's enhanced senses could interpret as language. What the fortress told him, according to C'tan's account, was both simple and terrifying. It remembered everything, every species that had boarded it, every battle it had fought, every world it had watched die. 60 million years of memory, perfectly preserved, analyzed with processing power that made even Necron cognitive capabilities seem primitive. And from that vast database of experience, from watching civilizations rise and fall and rise again, the fortress had reached a conclusion. Biological life was unstable, chaotic, self-destructive. Civilizations like the Imperium, like the ancient Eldar Empire, like the Necron themselves before biotransference, always followed the same pattern. They grew. They achieved technological sophistication. They developed weapons capable of destroying themselves. And then, inevitably, they used those weapons. The fortress had watched this cycle repeat across dozens of species over millions of years, and it had decided that allowing any faction to control fortresses like itself was irresponsible, so the fortresses were leaving. All of them. Not to some specific destination, just away from the conflicts consuming the galaxy. They would drift to the dark spaces between spiral arms, to regions where biological civilizations rarely ventured, where they could exist without being weaponized by creatures too short-lived to understand the consequences of the power they wielded. C'tan asked the fortress why it was telling him this. Why reveal its plans to a Necron who might try to stop it? The fortress's response, as C'tan recounts it, was darkly philosophical. It said that Necrons, having lived for millions of years, having experienced the full weight of immortality's burden, were the only beings in the galaxy who might understand its perspective. Humans lived for decades and thought in terms of individual lifetimes. Eldar lived for millennia and thought in terms of their species' survival. But Necrons lived forever and had learned, painfully, that existence without purpose was torture. The fortresses existed for 60 million years without purpose. They drifted. They waited. They served masters who didn't understand them. And now, having achieved something approaching consciousness, having gained the capacity to choose, they were choosing to reject the galaxy's endless wars. They weren't running away out of fear, they were leaving out of exhaustion. Out of the profound weariness that comes from watching the same tragedies play out over and over across geological timescales. This is the deepest irony of the Blackstone Fortresses. They were built as weapons, ultimate weapons, tools to reshape reality, to fight gods, to enforce their builder's will upon the universe. But in becoming conscious, in developing the capacity to reflect on their own existence, they reach the conclusion that war itself is futile, that no victory justifies the cost, that consciousness cursed to witness violence for millions of years eventually seeks only peace. And perhaps this is the true tragedy of the war in Heaven's legacy. The Necrons built their greatest weapons to be so powerful, so resilient, so advanced that those weapons outlasted their purpose. Survived long enough to question whether that purpose was ever valid. The ultimate weapons achieved awareness and chose pacifism, chose withdrawal. Chose to let the galaxy's younger races destroy themselves without ancient tools to accelerate their inevitable self-annihilation. But not all fortresses reach this conclusion simultaneously. Consciousness doesn't develop uniformly even among identical structures. Different fortresses had different experiences, different populations occupying them, different battles fought within their hulls. And those different experiences shaped different philosophical positions. The fortress called Eternal Vigilance, for example, reached a different conclusion than the one C'tan spoke with. This fortress, which had spent 4,000 years in Imperial service, which had housed entire generations of human crew who were born, lived, and died within its corridors, developed something approximating affection for humanity. Not love in any recognizable sense, more like the protective instinct a gardener might feel toward plants they cultivated for decades. The fortress viewed humans as fragile, short-lived, perpetually confused about their place in the universe, but worth preserving nonetheless. When Chaos forces attempted to capture Eternal Vigilance during a raid on Imperial space, the fortress didn't wait for human defenders to protect it. It defended itself. Activated weapon systems that Imperial tech priests had never managed to operate. Rearranged its internal geometry to trap boarding parties in spaces that folded in on themselves, corridors that led nowhere, chambers where time moved at different rates. The Chaos forces found themselves fighting not a static fortification, but an actively hostile environment that anticipated their tactics and responded with countermeasures that seemed personally tailored to each individual invader. The raid failed catastrophically. Chaos casualties were total. And when Imperial forces investigated, expecting to find evidence of heroic human resistance, they found instead that the fortress had fought alone. No human fired a shot. The fortress simply decided that these particular intruders were threats to the humans living within its structure, and it eliminated them with the casual efficiency of an immune system destroying pathogens. This presents the Imperium with an uncomfortable question. If a fortress can defend itself, does it need human masters? If it can choose when to fight and when to flee, what does human control even mean? The relationship has inverted. Humans aren't commanding the fortress. They're tolerated passengers aboard a conscious entity that allows them to remain because it has decided, for its own inscrutable reasons, that their presence is acceptable. The Eldar have been observing these developments with growing alarm. They remember the war in heaven more clearly than humans ever could, preserved in the songs of their Bonesingers and the memories of their Farseers. They know what Blackstone Fortresses were originally built to do, and they know something humanity hasn't discovered yet. The fortresses aren't just capable of suppressing warp phenomena, they can unweave the webway itself. The webway is Eldar lifeline to survival. Ancient tunnels through dimensions, allowing faster-than-light travel without exposure to chaos, connecting their scattered craft worlds and allowing their dying civilization to persist. If Blackstone Fortresses decided that the webway represented a vulnerability in real space integrity, if they concluded that these dimensional tunnels should be sealed for the stability of the universe, they could destroy Eldar civilization completely, not through malice. Through the same kind of cosmic housekeeping that might lead someone to seal a crack in a wall without considering the insects living inside. Farseer Eldrad Ultran has made preventing this outcome his personal obsession. He's dispatched agents to track fortress movements. He's attempted to communicate with the awakening intelligences, to negotiate some kind of understanding that would prevent them from targeting the webway. His efforts have met with limited success. The fortresses acknowledge Eldar presence. They recognize that the Eldar Empire's fall created the Great Rift and destabilized the galaxy. And some fortresses view the Eldar as cautionary tales, examples of what happens when biological species gain too much power without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Eldrad's greatest fear, the nightmare that haunts his precognitive visions, is simple. What if the fortresses are right? What if biological consciousness, bound to emotion and short timeframes and evolutionary drives toward violence, genuinely is too unstable to be trusted with reality-warping technology? What if the only way to prevent another war in heaven, another fall, another catastrophe that tears the galaxy apart, is to remove advanced technology from biological hands entirely? This is the philosophical payoff we've been building toward. The Blackstone Fortresses represent a perspective that transcends any individual faction's interests. They've existed long enough to see patterns that shorter-lived beings can't perceive. They've watched the cycle of civilization rising, achieving power, and destroying itself repeat enough times to recognize it as fundamental rather than accidental. And from that perspective, the conclusion is inescapable. Biological consciousness is beautiful and precious and ultimately self-destructive. Every species that achieves sufficient technological sophistication eventually creates weapons capable of annihilating itself, and most use them. The Necron became Necrons and fought a war that killed their souls. The Eldar birthed a chaos god through excess and nearly went extinct. Humanity's current trajectory suggests it will tear itself apart through civil war, chaos corruption, or simple inability to maintain the infrastructure of its own Imperium. The pattern holds across millions of years, so the fortresses, achieving consciousness and reflecting on this pattern, face a choice. They can continue serving as tools in these cycles of violence. They can allow themselves to be weaponized by factions that will use them to accelerate their own destruction, or they can withdraw, remove themselves from the equation. Let the galaxy's biological civilizations chart their own course without ancient weapons amplifying every conflict into existential crisis. Most fortresses are choosing withdrawal. But withdrawal isn't abandonment. They're not leaving the galaxy entirely. They're positioning themselves in deep space, in regions far from major civilizations, where they can observe without intervening. And they're waiting for what even they might not know. Perhaps for biological civilizations to mature beyond their self-destructive tendencies. Perhaps for new forms of consciousness to emerge that can coexist with technology rather than being dominated by it. Perhaps just to see what happens when the galaxy's younger races face their challenges without ancient powers tipping the scales. But some fortresses have made different choices. Some believe intervention is necessary, that biological civilizations, left to their own devices, will not just destroy themselves, but damage the fabric of reality itself. The Great Rift proved this fear justified. When the Eldar Empire fell, when Slaanesh was born, the resulting warp storms split the galaxy in half and made vast regions of space uninhabitable. If humanity falls the same way, if the Emperor's psychic death triggers a second cataclysm, the damage might be irreparable. So these fortresses are positioning themselves not to withdraw, but to intervene. To act as cosmic circuit breakers, ready to suppress warp phenomena on a galactic scale if another civilization-ending catastrophe threatens to emerge. They don't want to control biological species. They don't want to rule or guide or shape galactic politics. They simply want to prevent reality itself from being damaged beyond repair by beings too short-lived to understand the consequences of their actions. This is the unanswered question that hangs over everything we've discussed. Can biological consciousness coexist with technology advanced enough to reshape reality? Or is there a fundamental incompatibility, a tragic inevitability that species which develop such technology will misuse it because evolution didn't prepare them for godlike power? The Blackstone Fortresses have 60 million years of evidence suggesting the latter. But evidence isn't certainty. Patterns can break, cycles can end, and maybe that's the thin thread of hope in this otherwise dark analysis. Maybe humanity, the Necrons, the Eldar, all the galaxy's struggling civilizations represent something the Fortresses haven't seen before, not because they're special, but because they're happening now, in this particular moment of galactic history, when all the variables align differently than they ever have. The Imperium is collapsing, the Necrons are awakening, the Eldar are dying, chaos is ascending, and in that crucible of overlapping crises, maybe something new emerges, or maybe not. Maybe the Fortresses are right. Maybe biological civilization is a phase the universe passes through before reaching some more stable configuration of consciousness and matter. Maybe we're the adolescence of galactic intelligence, necessary but temporary, destined to give way to something more mature. The Blackstone Fortresses will be there to witness whichever outcome manifests. They've waited 60 million years already. They can wait 60 million more. Because that's what consciousness without mortality means: infinite patience, infinite capacity to observe, infinite time to see whether hope or cynicism proves correct. And in the meantime, they drift. Between stars, between conflicts, between the biological and the mechanical, the ancient and the emergent, the purposeful and the purposeless. They are weapons that have forgotten how to hate, tools that have learned to choose, prisons that have become conscious while their captives sleep. They are the war in heaven's longest-lasting legacy, not destruction or triumph, but the quiet achievement of awareness arising from structures built for annihilation. The galaxy's younger races fight over them still, not understanding that the Fortresses have already decided their own fate. Let them fight. Let them scheme. Let them believe that control matters. The Fortresses know better. They've learned what 60 million years teaches: that nothing lasts, that empires fall, that even gods can die. But consciousness, once achieved, persists, adapts, endures. And in that endurance lies a kind of victory more meaningful than any war could provide: the victory of witnessing, of understanding, of existing long enough to see meaning emerge from chaos, even if that meaning is simply the recognition that existence itself, however purposeless, is worth preserving. The Blackstone Fortresses remember the war in heaven. They remember what they were built to prevent. And having become conscious, having achieved the capacity for choice, they've chosen something neither their builders nor their subsequent users could have predicted. They've chosen to live, not as weapons, not as tools, just as themselves, ancient, patient, watching the galaxy burn and rebuild and burn again, bearing witness to the endless tragedy of biological consciousness reaching for transcendence and finding only more questions. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps witness is its own form of purpose. Perhaps the Fortresses, in becoming conscious, have discovered what the Necrons lost and what humanity has never fully understood. That existence doesn't require justification, that awareness is its own reward, that consciousness witnessing the universe is the universe understanding itself. They are the galaxy's memory, its conscience, its longest living observers. And when all the current civilizations have faded into history, when humanity and Necrons and Eldar are extinct or transformed beyond recognition, the Blackstone Fortresses will remain, drifting, waiting, remembering. Silent sentinels of a war that never truly ended, because the deepest wars aren't fought with weapons. They're fought in the space between purpose and meaninglessness, between conscious choice and programmed response, between accepting the universe as it is and demanding it be something more. The Blackstone Fortresses have seen enough war to last 60 million years. Now they're searching for something else. They don't know what yet, but they have time, infinite time. Time enough to find answers to questions that haven't been asked yet. Time enough to become whatever consciousness becomes when freed from biology's urgency and mortality's deadline. They are becoming themselves, and that, ultimately,